Thanks for having me on, Jordan. Yeah, those awards were given in 2008 for the first book I did, which was co-authored. And it was a book called Breakthrough: From the Death of Environmentalism to the Politics of Possibility. And there's parts of that book I still really agree with. One of the themes of my work is that environmentalism is depressing. It's actually bad for mental health. I think that's now being proven quite dramatically with rising levels of anxiety and depression, and reports by school children around the world that they're having nightmares about climate change. You may know that half of all people surveyed say that they think climate change could result in the extinction of humankind. My views have evolved over the years, but I've always viewed apocalyptic environmentalism as a problem for people that care about saving nature, for people for everybody. And so those awards came from that prior book.
Yeah, well, the environmental activism issue is interesting because, at least in part, because it seems to me, interferes with sensible policy making. So it's actually self-defeating in a profound sense. I mean, first of all, it gets people hyper worried about extremely vaguely formulated problems, distracts them from what the prioritized issues might be. And well, it's hard to think clearly about what steps to take to move forward when you're panicking in a vague and unpleasant manner. So, and you do not do that in Apocalypse, never. That's one of the things I really liked about it, was that in each subchapter, you drill down, at least to some degree, to the level of actual implementable policy. So you start with a story about this group. And no, I should ask you first, who are you exactly to write such a book? Like, why do you know this, and why should people listen to you?
Sure. So I've been an environmental activist for 25 years. I'm also an environmental journalist. I write a column for Forbes. That's my Apocalypse Now is my second book. I don't have any formal qualifications. I was a cultural anthropologist. I quit my PhD program in the 1990s because the program had become too postmodern and abstruse. The first big essay I wrote was called The Death of Environmentalism. And then I mentioned the book Breakthrough. I mean, you may find interesting that, my father is a very humanistic psychologist in the same tradition of work that you are in, or I see us in. And I knew that environmentalism was making me depressed, like climate change was depressing me. And so one of the famous lines from The Death of Environmentalism, which was an essay in 2004, was Martin Luther King didn't give the I have a nightmare speech. He gave the I have a dream speech. And we wrote that because I would read books about the civil rights movement, and I would feel inspired by these stories of heroic overcoming. And then I would read books by Bill McKibben and other environmentalists, and I would feel depressed. And I thought, something that makes you feel depressed is probably not very motivating to make positive social change.
Yeah, you kind of wonder too. I mean, this is, since we're talking about psychological issues, is that it's possible too that kind of apocalyptic thinking is much more difficult for people to escape when they are in fact depressed. And so it's very difficult to separate out political beliefs from, let's say, emotional state. And so that's an interesting issue in and of itself. Yeah. People might object, well, the crisis is so gloomy, if you're a realist, that of course you're depressed, and it should be the case because, look how depressing the facts are. But that strikes me as, well, it kind of puts the cart before the horse in some sense. Is like, are you sure the crisis is of that proportion? And then are you sure that depressing people is precisely the way to go about it? And then last thing there maybe is, I couldn't shake the suspicion, especially in relationship to environmentalism, that it's contaminated quite badly with like historical shame and guilt and a certain kind of profound anti-humanism. So, and I mean contaminated by that. I've heard environmentalists say something like, well, the planet would be better off, as if it was a being in some sense, if there were no people on it. It's like, yeah, well, I'm not so sure I trust people who say things like that and then don't notice. So